I will talk about White Rage by Carol Anderson. This book came about as an extended edition of a opinion column that she wrote on the Washington Post after the death of Michael Brown. She basically argued in this piece that whenever any Black Americans have gotten economic or political gains, it has come back to them in a backlash of white rage. The second chapter focuses on the Great Migration and Black Americans moving out of the South. They are able to move wherever they want in this country. That's one thing that we really value. If you don't like where you are at, you can technically get up and move somewhere else. But Carol Anderson shows us how that was totally a farce, how moving to areas that were considered white areas actually came back as violence towards the people who were trying to move. She focused specifically on the case of a doctor, a Black doctor. His name was Ossian Sweets, who moved from the Black area of Detroit into a white area. This was in the 1920s, I believe. The neighbors there did not want him there, and it led to some really violent repercussions. He tried to protect his property and his family, and he actually went to trial for it. The end of the chapter is so heartbreaking too. So I like that that chapter actually put like a face to the problem and showed you a specific case. The third chapter focuses on education and the backlash to Brown v. Board of Education, both how the South was very explicit in the way that they were trying to not integrate, and also the ways that the North was a lot more subtle. I thought there were some really great quotes in here that I wanted to read out loud to you guys so you can get an idea. She focused a lot on how not implementing Brown v. Board and the weight that happened before we fully integrated, and truly we're not fully integrated today, how that has actually hurt the growth of our economy and has put our economy and our country at risk. Even as thousands of African American children were left behind educationally, the economy was beginning a seismic transformation that will require even more of its citizens. Factory jobs, the one that President Franklin Roosevelt had once called the arsenal of democracy, the living wage with barely a high school diploma jobs, were rapidly disappearing. It wasn't quite perceptible then that the sector that at one time had accounted for 25% of all paid employment in the United States would be near collapse by the 1970s. By the time Prince Edward County, this is a county that she is specifically focusing on in this chapter, finally decided to implement at least parts of Brown in the 1970s, the heyday of industrial America, where gainful employment had not required a strong education, just a strong back, was already well over, with the knowledge-based economy taking hold. So by the time that they fully integrated their schools in the 70s, getting Black American children to learn the skills that would make them successful in this economy, the economy that they were trying to aspire to work in, collapsed. And then she really hits the nail on the head. Here she talks about how that's truly an economic risk for our entire country. She says, "It was not just Black America, however, that suffered the cost of this waste of human lives and talent. The brutally relentless tactics of stall and defy, then stall and undermine, tactics that went on for at least 4 decades, left the United States with millions of citizens who lacked the education needed to be competitive in a global, technology-driven economy. This, in turn, left the United States lagging behind other developed countries and placed the nation at enormous economic risk." And she has some stats for you. She says, "There was a prediction that whatever happened in America's classrooms in the 1950s would determine what the United States would look like half a century later. The deliberate omission of African Americans from the national defense education bore its bitter fruit. In 2004, 50 years after Brown, not a single African American earned a PhD in astronomy or astrophysics, according to the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. In fact, of the 2,100 PhDs awarded in 43 different fields in the natural sciences, not one of these doctoral degrees went to an African American. Now, in the 21st century, the sector of the U.S. economy that accounts for more than 50% of our sustained economic expansion, science and engineering, is relying on an ever-dwindling skilled and educated workforce. Whereas at one point, about 40% of the world's scientists and engineers resided in the U.S., according to Rodney C. Adkins, Senior Vice President of IBM, that number had shrunk to about 15% by 2012. In the next chapter, she discusses the rollback of civil rights and how people have tried to redefine racism to be more of an individual than a systemic problem. The whittling down of racism to sheet-wearing goons allowed a cloud of racial innocence to cover many whites who, although resentful of Black progress and determined to ensure that racial inequality remained untouched, could see and project themselves as the kind of upstanding white citizens who were positively outraged at the tactics of the Ku Klux Klan. The focus on the Klan helped to designate racism as an individual aberration rather than something systemic, institutional, and pervasive. You're redefining what racism is as just something that is overt, something that is verbal, something that is physical in the way you look, in the way you treat people, refusing to see that white supremacy is not just that, it is also the tactics that are used that don't allow economic, legal, and political equality for everybody in our country. So it's this focus on like the N-word, but not really thinking about housing policies. And then the 5th chapter, it will be the last one I'll talk about, is more about voting rights and how voter suppression has become such a prevalent thing in our country. I got some great things to read to you guys. So one example is this. In Wisconsin, for instance, a rigorous voter ID law was passed in the wake of charges of fraud at the polls after Obama's first election. But in a state with more than 3.4 million registered voters, the 10 to 12 people convicted of voter fraud each year were usually ex-felons who simply sought to cast a ballot before their voting rights had been restored. Even the Bush campaign's concerted drive to find rampant voter fraud throughout the nation uncovered that out of 197 million votes cast for federal candidates between 2002 and 2005, all of 26 convictions or guilty pleas were registered, roughly 0.0000013% of the tallied ballots. And then she definitely goes in on my state of Florida too, with good reason, because Rick Scott and his government are in on this voter fraud stuff too. Florida has been one of the most aggressive states to adopt this procedure, using records from the Department of Motor Vehicles to identify and scrub 180,000 names from the voter rolls. More importantly, it began this purge just months before the upcoming 2012 presidential election, limiting the opportunity for individuals to verify the reliability of the redacted list. Voters showed up at the polls only to find that their names were nowhere to be found. They had been disenfranchised. Indeed, after the election, Florida's Secretary of State identified only 85 names out of the original 180,000 that should have been removed from the list. So overall, this book was really eye-opening. It was insightful, it was well written, it was clear, concise. There were probably less than 5 things in here that I disagreed with, and everything else I was just like, yes, that's really smart, and thank you for doing research on that and putting it in those words and creating this chapter that makes so much sense to me. So I definitely recommend White Rage, and that is one done from my Get Informed TBR that I made recently. The next thing that I will talk about is The Fact of a Body by Alexandria Marzano-Lesvenich. So this is Alexandria Marzano-Lesvenich's memoir, but she does something very different here, and you can see it in the cover. It is a murder and a memoir. So she definitely talks about her life, her childhood, the trauma that she faced in her childhood, but she also discusses one specific criminal case that has kind of taken over her life and that she has been very drawn to. She discovered this as an intern when she was in law school, basically fought to get people off the death penalty. And she was meant to do that for this one man who was a child molester and who was facing the sentence not only of child molestation but of murder as well of the child. And she came to this as someone who was irrevocably against the death penalty, and after meeting this man and reading about his case, she's kind of siding the other way. She kind of does not believe that he should get out of the death penalty. She explains that to us by describing her childhood and her memories from childhood and her family. She definitely had a very difficult childhood. Her family also did not help in that way, and I'll already from here say that there are massive trigger warnings in this book. Probably the book that I would say has the most serious trigger warnings that you can imagine. There is a lot of stuff in here about child molestation. I will just put that out there. This book was extremely uncomfortable to read sometimes. So because she becomes overcome with this case, she decides that she's going to learn more about his family and where he came from. So she really goes in deep on his life, learning more about all the difficulties that his family faced. Not that she is excusing him at all for what he did, but kind of to try to see a more 3D picture of his life. I really enjoyed how the author was so honest and open about her own childhood and the traumas that she faced, and I feel like if she had just focused on that in this book, like if it had just been about her life, I feel like it would have been a perfect book. Like it would have been an insightful book. My problem here was definitely trying to intertwine these two stories together, trying to compare her life and her family to his life and his family. And I think that's where this fell apart for me. I feel like she really sought meaning and poetic resonance between these two situations. I think for some people, she does this well. Like, she's a good writer, that she is bringing a lot of emotions to the table and a lot of difficult discussions to the table. But for me, I felt like she could have done that so much better by just telling her story. And I felt like she didn't really need to devote so much time and mind space to his story. I think it's also the fact that, I mean, she flat out tells you this, but it's something that I was not okay with the entire book. She's going to imagine situations, she is going to assume the feelings of people and what they might have been thinking at that moment, and even like creating outfits and like the way people look. There is definitely a lot of true crime books out there that toe the line between what they suppose happened, but this book, I felt like she did it multiple times where I felt really uncomfortable reading it, and I have examples to show you. Lorelai is 4 months pregnant with Jeremy's half-brother. The nausea must have woken her this morning. She must have felt the dull twinges of the pregnancy in her stomach, the twinges that meant the baby was alive. I feel like she's way too involved in telling us what these real life people might be thinking and feeling. It's not like she went up to this woman and asked her what she was feeling and interviewed her about it. No, she's just telling you what she thinks the woman was feeling. And I think she actually explained to me why I did not jive with this book in a chapter where she talks about how she's trying to seek meaning out of this. She says, "In the long silence, I feel keenly just how strange it is that I know so much about this family, how strange it is that I've come here at all. I want to tell him something that will make it all make sense for him, but how can I explain that I am trying to chase down the origin of this story because I can't find the origin of my own life, that I need to understand how Bessie buried her children, because in her is Lorelai and in her is my mother." So she is really assuming that these families can be compared. Like, this is her way of making sense of it, but at the end of the day, these are real people, and a lot of time is devoted to a convicted child murderer, and not much time is devoted to the victim. And last but not least, I will talk about Unmentionable by Therese Oneill. This is a complete shift from the last book. This was actually a really fun and entertaining little book that tours you through the Victorian era and what it would have been like to live there. You know, what you would dress like, what kind of makeup you would put on, what kind of manners you must have, what courting would be like, and marriage, and dealing with hysteria in this time period. And she does this in a very funny, lighthearted tone. The best for me here were like the real legit quotes that she put in from doctors and quacks of them trying to tell us how women should behave. My favorite one probably from Dr. Hoff. "She is much less often or early ready. In its unexcited state, her vagina is lax, and its walls close together and somewhat harsh and dry, little lubricating secretion being present. The modest bride has no desire that this sacred vestibule to the great arcana of procreation shall be immediately invaded." But yeah, this was actually quite fun because it reminded me a lot of lectures and books that I read while I was in college. They went a lot in here on the Comstock laws, which I took like a whole class that we devoted like 1/4 of the class to just talking about when abortion became a crime again after not being a crime in 1873 and all the Comstock laws. So that was definitely fascinating to get a refresher on that. I think the only real thing here that some people might not like as much is that the tone sometimes might get a little bit old. The way that she writes this is like she's directly talking to you, and also some subjects and some topics are going to be more interesting than others. So I also kind of felt that way as I was reading. Like I didn't care as much about the manners as I did about like courting and having children, and you have hysteria as a result. And that is finally it for the books that I have read recently. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If any of these sound interesting to you, or if you've read any of them, let me know in the comments. I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.